Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to this who knows how many celebrations of Memorial Day to honor those who served for the Union in our Civil War. And we're here at a representative area where some of these soldiers were buried. And we will give you a chance later on to decorate the graves of these soldiers and sailors with the flowers that have been provided. I am First Sergeant Sager, and it's my duty to perform the duties of commander of the group this morning. So, first of all, I want to recognize that this is a special day in that the monument that you see here at the center of the circle was dedicated on this date in 1887. And I'd like to recognize Bruce Hoffman, who has the information that appeared in the newspaper that day. Bruce?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just take the first paragraph out of the local newspaper that was written the day after this happened. Memorial Day in this city was observed with more than the ordinary degree of interest, owing to the dedication of the Grand Army of the Republic's monument at Wildwood. The weather was all that could have been desired, and many thousands wended their way to the beautiful cemetery on the hillside, where the imposing and impressive ceremonies took place. So that was May 30th, Monday, May 30th, 1887, 135 years ago to the date. That monument. Now, the back of the monument says 1886 because it was erected actually late in the year of 1886, but it wasn't officially dedicated until that Memorial Day, 1887.
Thank you, Bruce. We will be following the ceremony that was prescribed for the Grand Army of the Republic in memorializing the Civil War dead. And I'm reading from that program, let's say. Friends, we assemble once more to pay our tribute of love and respect, and within these sacred bounds to pledge anew our fealty to their memory and the principles for which they fought. With bowed heads, solemn tread, and voices hushed, we meet to remind our people of their duty to the soldiers and sailors who wore the blue, to the flag for which they fought, to the country for which they died, and that it is for us to keep green the memories of their heroic service and unselfish sacrifice. May we fully realize the sanctity of the place and hour. May our conduct give assurance of the sincerity of our purpose and our earnest appreciation of the duties and responsibilities devolving upon us. I will ask the chaplain now to invoke the divine blessing.
Supreme ruler of the universe, God of battles and peace, we thank thee for this day, this hour, for this blessed privilege of meeting here to do homage to our nation's dead. We thank thee that in the day of trouble and the hour of danger, thou in thy infinite wisdom raised up men who were ready to do battle and if need be to die, that this country might be preserved. Grant, we beseech thee, thy countenance of thy watchful care. Grant thy blessing upon these sacred ceremonies, consecrated as they are to the memory of the brave and loyal hearts who dared stand for the right and did not fear to bare their breasts to a storm of steel in defense of liberty, a united country, and a brotherhood of man. Bless our country, preserve its integrity. Make it, we pray, thee an instrument of thy hands for great good. Hear and answer, we beseech thee. Amen.
We're going to ask for your participation several times during the ceremony. And the first one is, join me in singing the song, My Country 'Tis of Thee. If you don't remember the words, I have trouble with those too. We don't sing it very often as we probably should. My country 'tis of thee. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. I'd now like to call on the chaplain for any appropriate remarks he wishes to make.
Good morning. The Chancellorsville campaign concluded on May 6th, reducing the ranks of Mr. Lincoln's Army of the Potomac by approximately 16,030 killed, wounded, or missing. 12,281 Confederates suffered the same fate, which means roughly a total of 17,311 American lives were affected because people cannot settle their differences peacefully. This is sad, and so is knowing that more battles will occur before a civil war ends. Sadness abounds within the acres of this well-kept cemetery where many U.S. flags fly above the graves of veterans from numerous wars. Some of the deceased perished in distant battles, others survived, but were crippled or mourning the loss of fallen comrades and living with painful memories until they too were interred in this sacred place. Armistice happens. Veterans' ranks thin and vanish, causing many to become forgetful. Once I thought that no war really ends until all that fought it answer final roll call. Not true, for every armed conflict from the Revolution to now leaves a lasting effect of historical traces affecting things the way they are now today. Someone gave Pastor Lee this book. They did not realize its value or even want it. We have a great problem now because too many people do not value our nation's history or learn any of its lessons or realize what it cost in lives to establish and preserve this country, and hopefully pass it on as an inheritance to those who are unborn. This very booklet was published during a depression when the ranks of the Civil War veterans were growing thin, and those who remembered the Maine and the ensuing war with Spain still lived, and World War I veterans were as numerous as the pine needles of a forest. All of the aforementioned are gone, 159 years removed from 1863. Grandsons of the Civil War veterans had thinning ranks as World War II veterans. The way of mortality goes that those who wore the uniform of a particular conflict and age pass till none are left to tell their stories and their tales. Thus, it falls to you, the faithful living, to listen carefully with the heart for symbolic whispers from these headstones, from these flags that snap in spring breezes. Find us, remember those who are gone. Do not let us be forgotten, for this is more than a day of a once-a-year sale at a store open on a holiday. Inside of the flyleaf, the proceedings of the 64th Annual Encampment, Department of Pennsylvania, Grand Army of the Republic, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, June 11th and 12th, 1930. In the flyleaf, I will read just the little poem that was written by Edgar A. Guest. Show the flag and signify that it wasn't born to die. Let its colors speak for you that you are standing true, true in the sight of God and man. To work, that flag began. Show the flag. The day is gone when men blindly hurry on, serving only gods of gold. Now the spirit that was cold warms again to courage fine. Show the flag and fall in line. Sergeant?
Thank you, Chaplain. In past occasions like this, I have taken it upon myself as a mission to acquaint the audience with some particular aspect of the Civil War era that maybe you have not heard before or would like to be refreshed. And so I've chosen today to talk about the technology of the Civil War. You know, we say that all wars change technology. The Civil War made many, many changes in technology. And what I would like to talk about today is the arms carried by the foot soldier in the Civil War. The person in charge of providing arms and equipment to the soldiers was the Ordnance Department, and the head of the Ordnance Department was a Brigadier General Ripley. And I want to give you the mission, before we get launched into this, of remembering a date. And that date is 1852. Keep that in mind. General Ripley had presided over a post-war era, or actually it became a pre-war era, in which his job was pretty simple. He had a small army scattered around the West. All he had to do was keep them supplied with the current weapons, whatever it was, and his job was done. Imagine, if you will, all of a sudden, General Ripley is tasked with providing an army of 75,000 when called upon by President Lincoln. He does not have enough firearms to provide for them. So suddenly, a mass confusion resulted. There was a need for 75,000 troops, or 75,000 firearms to put in the hands of those troops so that they could go to war. So the things that were thought of were, well, maybe we can buy some overseas. So some agents were sent to Europe, and they tried to procure whatever firearms were available over there. Springfield Army was one of the two U.S. armies, and they were in charge of keeping the standards of quality and so on. And but they could not start working at that level without a build-up period. So we have this situation with agents going to Europe, Confederate agents bidding against Union agents in Europe, sometimes states bidding against the federal government, and so on. It was a mess, lots of confusion. Eventually this was sorted out, and the system that evolved was a contract system where gun makers in the primarily in the Massachusetts, Connecticut Valley region were contracted out to build what was the existing musket at that time. And when I say musket, I mean a rifle with a long barrel. So let me talk about the existing technology. This is an example of, the correct terminology is rifle musket model of 1861. And this was a .58 caliber weapon. It was well built. The standards were very high at the National Army, and it had a couple of major disadvantages though. First of all, it had to be loaded from the muzzle. So, I mean, you set it on the ground, you pulled a cartridge out of your cartridge box, you bit it off, you poured the powder in the barrel, you put the bullet in the barrel, you pulled the ramrod out, turned it over, shows it's empty, and to return it underneath the barrel. You don't want to run away from your ramrod because you need that. And then you had to put a percussion cap on the cone here, and then it would finally fire. As you can imagine, this took a little time. The best soldiers, the best trained soldiers could fire 3 times a minute. And that was when they weren't scared or running or what have you. It's under the best of circumstances, they could get out 3 times a minute. The other things were, you had to load pretty much standing up. It's tough to do that. You can do it lying down, but that even adds more confusion to the whole mess. The good thing is that these were fine quality. This was the top of the technology in 1861. They were made with interchangeable parts. In other words, they were designed for mass production. And there were things like little details like the shape of the tang on the end of the barrel here was curved so that you didn't have to hand cut a square end on that. The same thing with the trigger guard here. You could route it out. All but a little bit of this firearm could be made, machine made. And it was relatively easy to get this out to 23 different contractors, and they would make muskets to this pattern. By the way, let me explain the term musket. Over the years, military arms were smoothbore, they were not rifled, and they had a long barrel, either 40 or 42 inches. So that was called a musket. Then in 1855 we started providing rifling to these muskets. And so it became a rifle musket. So the correct terminology is rifle musket, model of 1861. Short-term musket. Everybody just called these muskets anyway. Shorter barreled firearms were called rifles. So there was a little confusion there, but we call this a musket. As I said earlier, 23 contractors were provided with contracts to make as many muskets as they could. And some of the names are still familiar, such as Colt, Remington, and Savage were all making Civil War muskets, and they cranked out as many as they possibly could. By the end of the war in 1864, 1,500,000 of these had been built. And they were all built to a uniform standard. That, to me, is an incredible achievement. I got into a discussion, let's say, with my father once upon a time, and he said, oh, 19th century stuff, just really crude and all that. I said, okay, how about if we do a little test of the quality of these things? I happen to have 2 or 3 in my collection. One of them made in Springfield, like this one, and a Trenton, let's say, and a Bridesburg, made in 3 different locations. I said, how about if we just try one little insignificant part of this gun and see what the qualities were? So we chose the rear sight leaf. I said, let's just measure three rear sight leaves and see how they come out. We measured, 2 of these measured 360 thousandths of an inch, and the third one measured 361, so there was a total of 1,000th of an inch difference in 3 different muskets. So that's the quality standards that were kept. To make this musket, sub-inspectors inspected every part of the gun. And when it was done, they stamped it. They each had a letter or a number that they stamped the part to show that it achieved that quality. And when the whole musket was done, the final inspector would stamp his own stamp on the left side of the stock. And then it was able to be paid for. And only after all that rigid inspection were these muskets paid for to the contractors. And we're talking about around $20 to $21. That's in 1861 dollars. Okay? That they were paid. And as I said before, they were the best technology available. These were good quality pieces. There was nothing wrong with them. They survived to the end of the war. However, you can imagine how challenging it is to load 3 times a minute with a paper cartridge that you get out of your cartridge box. You bite it, nasty, salty tasting powder. You dump the powder in the bore, you put the bullet in the bore, and use the ramrod to load it. There had to be a better way. What was the date I told you to remember before? 1852. There was a tremendous young inventor by the name of Christopher M. Spencer, who in 1852 had decided it was time to invent a better firearm. He saw that things were shaping up to what might be a war. So he developed a 7-shot breech-loading repeater. This technology was available in 1852 and was certainly available in 1861. However, the Ordnance Department was deeply concerned that soldiers in the field would fire too many shots and they would waste their ammunition. So if they could only fire 3 rounds a minute, there's not much ammunition to be wasted. So this is General Ripley and his philosophy, let's say. So the inventor who patented his particular breech-loading repeater was Christopher M. Spencer. And as I mentioned briefly before, it was a repeater, did not have to be loaded from the muzzle. It was using metallic cartridges like a modern 22 round, a giant size 22 round. And these were waterproof, they were rapidly loaded, You didn't have to worry about paper getting wet or breaking apart or any of that. And come on, you may enjoy it. So, the better idea was Spencer's repeater. And, pretty clear. I have an example here of a Spencer. This is a whole better idea. This rifle is not loaded from the muzzle. It's loaded from a magazine here. You take the magazine tube out, you can put 7 preloaded rounds in there. They're metallic, they don't get wet, it doesn't particularly bother them, and so on. And you push the magazine fowler back in, you work the breech, and that's all it takes. You're loaded and ready to go. Fire 7 rounds. Well, the U.S. Navy was convinced that this is a good way to go. Through connections with Christopher Spencer, they contracted for 10,000 Spencer rifles. The Army wasn't buying it. Still, it was General Ripley. Too much ammo. So anyway, Spencer did not have a factory, had no means of production at that point, but he was a go-getter. He formed a company, and they bought a factory in, ready for this, one end of the Chickering Piano Factory in Boston. Now, if you can imagine, one end, you have all kinds of machines going. You have trip hammers, you have lathes, you have milling machines, you have drill presses, grinders, and all that. On the other end of the factory, you have a guy with a tuning fork trying to tune up his piano to send out the door. So, nevertheless, they did make it work. And I want to say a little bit about Christopher Spencer. He was quite, at the time he invented this rifle, he was working in a silk ribbon factory, far enough from a rifle. He was young. He had been 22 when he was originally had developed the rifle. He was around 30 when he started the factory and got it going full speed. And after the initial Navy contract, they decided that he was hanging around, there wasn't that much to do, so they sent him out on a sales trip to the Army. And he took a rifle and a case of ammunition, and he went around to the different locations where there are troops located. And he got to a position where a Colonel Wilder and his brigade were stationed, and he put on a demonstration for them. And boy, did they get it. They wanted Spencers instead of those single-shot muzzleloaders they had. And so, this is kind of unbelievable. So the colonel of the brigade wrote back to the hometown bank and floated a loan to buy 1,400 Spencer rifles. And each individual soldier in his command signed a promissory note to pay $35. And $35 was a month and a half pay for the soldiers. So they were promising away a month and a half's pay to obtain these better ideas. Not from the Ordnance Department, but I'm going to ditch these. So a little bit later, after these 1,400 rifles came in and were issued out to the Wilders Brigade, they were involved in an altercation with the Confederate troops at a place called Hoover's Gap. They were actually outnumbered by the Confederate troops 5-1. But because of the volume of fire coming from the Spencers, the Confederate troops thought they were outnumbered and they retreated. So this was a pretty good sales tool, believe me. And after that, Wilder's group became known as the Lightning Brigade. And word started getting through the rest of the Army that these things really work, and they're something that you need to get equipped with. But up until this point, the idea of the Ordnance Department was single-shot, muzzle-loading muskets. So I don't know how many men had to die because of that. And just that faulty thinking in my mind, if you just think about it a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. Sure, the Confederates manufactured their own arms too, but they did not have the technology to manufacture quantities of copper cartridge cases for the Spencer. And so they could have never caught up to the number of Spencers that were put out in the U.S. Army. And by the end of the war, there were 94,000 of these rifles and carbines in the hands of the troops. And they were particularly prized for the mounted soldiers, the cavalry troops, because you can imagine it's pretty hard to load a muzzleloader on horseback. And experiments had been going on as to which was the best breech-loading carbine up until that point. And Spencers were starting with the Battle of Gettysburg. For a long time, we didn't think there were Spencers at the Battle of Gettysburg, but there were, and they did quite well. So anyway, to pick up the story of C.M. Spencer, after he supervised the factory and what have you, as I said, things got slow. He put on this sales tour and sold Spencers to the U.S. Army. He lived to invent many other things. He lived well into the 20th century, and he and his son became interested in aviation, so they learned how to fly. So this is C.M. Spencer. So we have to admire him, but we wish his innovation had taken hold a lot sooner, and maybe the war would have been shortened by a considerable amount. So this is, to my mind, just a small instance of how technology sometimes does or does not overcome backward thinking, such as the Ordnance Department. I believe personally it would have shortened the war because the Confederates were not able to keep up production as the Federals did, and probably would have shortened the war by months, if not years. And so I present that as an example of technology maybe going wrong, not accepted by those who should have made the decisions. So I give you the Spencer. Now going to ask for your participation again. Please join me in singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Stand if you wish, get your circulation going. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He
has loosed the faithful lightnings of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
St. John Company. Shoulder, hood. Present, hood. Commence firing. Shoulder, hood. Right, hood. Right, hood. present Hans. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our part of the ceremony. We're asking your participation now, as you're able, to decorate the graves of the soldiers buried here with flowers. We have the flowers around the circle. We ask you to keep in mind that soldier or sailor when you take the flowers and lay them on the grave. There are plenty of flowers, so please be dismissed and help yourself to some flowers, decorate the graves. Thank you for coming. Order Hans. In place, rest.